Ok. Ok, estamos saliendo al aire en 3, 2, 1.
Muy buenos días, van entrando.
Good morning, everyone. I see our participants are coming into the room, so let's wait just a second.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos.
Okay, again, very good morning. Thank you for being with us today. I am Maria Camila Uribe, I'm the coordinator of the IDB Cities Network. And that network facilitates the exchange of knowledge and solutions to deal with the common challenges faced by the organization and Latin America and the Caribbean. We create an opportunity for dialogue by transferring knowledge, and we provide exchanges to identify shared problems and alternatives to solve them, and to strengthen the capacity of our cities in the region. Now, in terms of the main areas covered by the Sustainable Development Growth, we look at urban resilience. So I would welcome you to the third webinar in our series on the way to Glasgow. And we are looking for logical responses in the region, and that in terms of the COP26 being held in Glasgow. Now, here we have a climate vision, regions, countries that currently represent 76% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The cities in the region have a date for carbon neutrality. The cities play a main role in this fight against climate change, since not only are they responsible for up to 76% of the world's energy demand, but also they are quite vulnerable to climate change, and especially in this region. The populational density, the concentration of infrastructure, and the fact that historically our cities are built close to water sources means that being resilient has to be a priority for this decade. Today, we're going to be talking about decarbonization of cities, innovations in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a conversation that we organized working with the Transport Division of the bank, and we want to look at the status of decarbonization of transport in the region and refer to the potential offered by other alternatives like metro cables. We will be talking about zero carbon cities, electromobility, and climate change commitments, and electromobility as a social tool. That is the case of a metro cable. Now, before we get started, I wanted to tell you a bit about the format of this workshop and give you some instructions. We're going to have two blocks for our discussion. First, we're going to have an introduction to the zero carbon city, and we will hear from two cities. We'll hear from Mexico City and Santo Domingo. And in the second block, we will get into the metro cable as a tool for electrified transportation, but also how it affects the construction in the city and the social impact. There we will be focusing on Medellin. So we hope that all of these experiences will be motivating and will encourage everyone to think of this situation as an opportunity to create more sustainable cities in the region. After we have these two blocks, we will have questions from the audience, and they will be answered by our panelists. Please submit your questions through the chat. And remember, This webinar will be given in Spanish, but there is interpretation into English and Portuguese. What you have to do is click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. To begin this webinar, and this will be enriching in today's context of COP26, I wanted to call on Ernesto Stein, our IDB representative Mexico. He will be moderating this webinar. And thank you, and Ernesto, thank you for joining us this morning. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Camila. Thank you for your excellent introduction. Good morning, everyone. It is a true pleasure for me to be with you today. As you know, in the framework of COP21 that was organized in Paris in 2015, world leaders promised to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees centigrade, to hopefully keep it below 1.5 centigrade. And in the Paris Accord, the idea was to intensify efforts to reduce emissions so as to, by 2050, have carbon net zero. Since last Sunday, the 31st of October in Glasgow, COP26 is being held, and in that way it will be possible to fine-tune the cooperation measures under the Paris Agreement. And in this context, urban development through the Cities Network has been organizing different meetings leading up to COP26 so as to support the cities of Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at how to improve our technical wherewithal and how to facilitate financing adaptation, taking advantages of opportunities for decarbonization and having local policies that are effective and to connect those commitments to the national levels. Latin America is an urban area where urbanization is something like 80%. And also they consume most of the energy demand. Their utilities, transportation use much of that power. So for all of these reasons, action at the local level is pressing, and all of this is essential to comply with the commitments under the Paris Agreement. All of this is part of Vision 2025 of the IDB. We need to identify ways to accelerate post-pandemic recovery in the region, especially helping the countries promote resilience, mitigation, adaptation to climate change. And these are key elements given the great vulnerability. As Maria Camila was saying, our region is vulnerable to climate change, and also there has been an increased incidence in natural disasters. Now, cities have to play a key role helping countries attain their goals. So we're going to look at climate change within that vision 2025 of the bank. Now we're going to be looking at ways of decarbonizing transportation in cities and the role that needs to be played by using cable cars as an urban mobility modality. That is an innovation from Latin America. Used to, that technology was basically used for people visiting ski areas, helping them get to the top of the mountain. But now this has become a semi-mass transportation modality that provides transportation for users. Many of them are low income, and it improves public transportation. The transportation system in the region produces 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and that means it creates a lot of CO2 per capita. Now, this emission of greenhouse gases goes along with other polluting products of the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. All of this affects the health of the people, producing respiratory conditions, etc. So transportation becomes a key piece in public policies in terms of decarbonizing cities and also in terms of urban health. As Maria Camila was saying, the webinar is going to be structured in the following way. First of all, we are going to hear about zero carbon cities that will be given by Ilan Cooperstein from C40. And then we will hear from Rodrigo Diaz from Mexico City. He's going to be talking about the cable bus, that's a mobility plan. And then we will hear from Alejandra Seno, who will be telling us about decarbonization of public transportation in the city. And then in the second part, we will be looking at the social impact of metro cables. And Julio Davila will be presenting a recent paper that he wrote on this issue, focusing on Medellin. And then we have guests from these two cities that will be making comments based on their own experience from the standpoint of what has happened in their own cities. So with that, I want to give the microphone to Ilan Cooperstein so he can tell us about zero carbon cities. Please go ahead, Ilan. Thank you, and good morning. Ernesto, thank you for that introduction. And greetings, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for your invitation. This issue is a very timely one. It comes at a time when Glasgow is discussing the most important issues on the climate agenda. It is discussing decarbonization. And so it is a pleasure that I can share with you something that was said, that was announced by the mayor of Los Angeles, who said that 1,000 cities have committed. I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment, but that the cities have committed to zero carbon, and that would be compatible with the 1.5 degrees, which is the ambitious target set by the Paris Accords for 2050, trying to cut emissions in half by 2030. So with you, I wanted to share you the vision. I wanted to tell you what C40 is doing as we work towards making Latin America cities zero carbon cities. Now, I am presenting with Miguel Oliveira, who is the regional director for Latin America. He and I have been working on these projects together. First of all, C40, very briefly, is a network of global megacities. We have 47 members, and this is led by mayors with a view to dealing with the climate crisis. So it's less than 100 cities, but they represent something like 8% of the world's population and 1/4 of the world's GDP. So the number of cities is relatively small, but the impact is enormous. And we know that these cities have a major role in terms of the urban development trajectory of other cities, especially beginning with metropolitan areas, but also other smaller or medium-sized cities. So C40 is cities for cities. There's always a mayor who chairs the network. So here you can see the most recent 4. Currently, the chair is in the hands of the mayor of Los Angeles, and the baton will soon be passed to the mayor of London, who was chosen by a council of mayors representing all the areas of the world. And here you can see our main donors, Bloomberg Philanthropies, CIFF, that are supporting this project. Now, in Latin America, we have 12 cities that are committed to neutrality towards 2050. And those commitments go back 2 years. The first cities that committed themselves went back to 2018 with something called Deadline 2020. And we began to support the cities that are represented here on the map, going from Mexico down to Argentina. The idea was to help them prepare a climate change action plan aligned with the Paris Accord. So there is a specific methodology that was prepared to support cities in implementing these plans that are necessarily local, and they can be shared and aligned with the overall goals in the Paris Agreement. Now, here we have the mayor of Bogota, Claudia Lopez, and Horacio Rodriguez Larreta from Buenos Aires. So this is the planning framework that I just mentioned. So we actually began in Paris to work with McKinsey, CONAVO, with different UN agencies, with the IDB too. We began to work on coming up with local plans that would be compatible with the Paris Agreement. So these are the four ingredients so as to have an emissions reduction plan with 2050 as the ultimate goal, but also working towards that goal. So the idea is to have resilience to climate threats, social benefits, governance, collaboration. And so we are complying with our targets, but also we have to plan for adaptation and resilience. We have to also be clear on governance and how these plans that include all the municipal administration, transportation, health, energy, the environment, of course, the economy, transportation, all of those issues require governance, and there has to be collaboration within the mayor's office, but also within social society. And all of this produces social benefits. So this was a requirement put on the table by the mayors of Latin America. They, right from the beginning of the program, clearly understood that dealing with climate change involves dealing with social issues. And that is why you have to highlight the social benefits of these actions, especially by measuring, to the extent possible, the impact on the most vulnerable. So energy, renewable energy, clean transportation, those measures, how do they impact those groups that are most vulnerable to climate impacts? Usually these are racial or ethnic minorities, they are low income, they are women, etc. But all of that has to be present as of the time when actions are being planned. And to plan, you have to have an overview. You have to understand what the profile of emissions is in the Latin American cities. And this is based on the information that we receive from the cities that belong to C40. You can see the profile of these emissions. So here it's important to realize that this is per capita. We're talking about cities like Mexico City and Sao Paulo. They are the largest metropolis in the region, but also we have Curitiba with 3 million people. So per capita is important, but also another important thing is to look at the emissions broken down by sector, because we can see in the world that energy, what is called stationary energy, and that is in the teal color, it is predominant, but not in Latin America. In Latin America, transport for most cities is the most emitting sector for greenhouse gases. Here you can see Mexico City. And here it's important to look at the per capita, but you can see that it is led by energy that is not under the control of the city, but transportation is the major sector, followed by other metropolis. But to get a broader view of the Americas, here what we can see is all of the cities in C40 from both Latin America and North America. And you can see on a per capita basis that Buenos Aires leads Latin America, but all of the North American cities are above the highest emitter from Latin America. And that gives us a global perspective too, because here you can see 5.64, that is the average of C40 cities in the world. And that is 5 tons of GHG per inhabitant. And the goal to get to 2030 with 1/2 of the emissions is to get that down to 2.9. That would be the number for the cities. But here, if we go back, we can see that for Latin America, we are already below that mean. So most cities are already there, and only a few cities are above this target for 2030. So in Latin America, the idea is to make certain that development is necessary, especially socioeconomic development in our cities is essential, but we want to make sure that development is low emission. Here you can see that we're already below the world average, and we are within the, or we're below the target for 2030. But the whole idea is to improve all of the social and economic indicators without increasing emissions. That is what we call decoupling. That is how we're going to know whether or not we are winning the battle in the Americas. Another important thing to look at is risks. Zero carbon cities cannot leave out adaptation. So these are the risks based on climate action plans where we support cities to do a risk analysis. And here you can see that the most frequent ones, and this is based on 11 cities, the 11 cities say that a major risk that is growing is flooding, followed by heat islands, landslides, drought, wildfires, and sea level rise. Now, what are the priority sectoral actions that come out of these climate action plans of the megacities of Latin America? You can see that these are the three emitting sectors that are most important. This is led by transportation, and here we can see four actions that are key and that, of course, are interlinked. We have a switch to public transportation. In Latin America, we already have the highest levels of use of public transportation in the world, but that is something we can still improve upon. In Latin America, we have a lot of megacities, as we already said, and as Mr. Stein said, Latin America is highly urbanized, so we have to make certain that growth will continue, but also continue to provide good mass transportation. Also, we have to transition to zero carbon emissions in the bus, truck, taxi, and other light vehicle fleets. That is something that we're going to be looking at in Santiago and Bogota, other cities too. And urban planning has to be aligned with the city in 15 minutes. That contains definitions we're already acquainted with. For example, having greater centralization, more employment hubs, also public services have to be close to residential neighborhoods so that we don't have millions of people going to one downtown where all of the jobs are every day, which creates a very high environmental and socioeconomic cost. And lastly, active mobility. And of course, this has to be connected to public transportation for that last mile. Then the second issue is energy and building. Now, here the two major issues, not the only ones, are distributed renewable energy. In other words, we need to have more renewable energy projects in our cities, and that also produces socioeconomic benefits. For example, fighting energy poverty. And here in Brazil, I'm speaking from Brazil, one of our issues is the energy cost because of the fossil fuels that have to be used because it is raining less. So there has to be some insurance against the scarcity of energy sources and price increases. Then another thing that is essential is the energy efficiency in existing and new buildings. So we know that many of these cities are not going to grow all of that much in future years, but we do have to formalize our informal settlements, which also means construction. And there's also a built component that has to be made more energy efficient. And then waste, that is the third element. Before we look into major issues. We have to look at composting, dealing with organic waste, and we can use composting, biomethanization, because it is
disminución de consumo, etcétera.
organic waste. And here you can see, and I think I'm running out of time, but I did want to share this example with you. This is what we have done. This is a specific action having to do with electric buses. We have a project that is called Zebra. This is a zero emissions bus fleet, and we have 2,484 in the region. The cities were able to have 2,482 electric buses on the street, and that is the second largest fleet, surpassed only by China. So I invite you to look at this website where you can see basically in real time the new fleets that are being put on the streets in Latin America. That is a success stories that we want to share with you in Latin America and other regions. I'm sorry if I went over my time limit. Thank you. And with that, I give the floor back to Maria Camila or to Mr. Stein. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ilan. That was an excellent presentation, and it gives us a good overview of all of these issues. And this is very helpful as a framework for the rest of our webinar. Now, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First of all, you talked about 1,000 cities committing to this zero carbon project, and that is good news and needs to be celebrated. Another thing, you said that actions are required in a whole series of different issues, and this is one of the complex issues of fighting climate change. And that is, you have to have a multi-sectoral approach. In other words, this is an issue that doesn't fall under one ministry, one government agency, and often it's hard to achieve that coordination across agencies, but this is absolutely essential to be able to deal with these problems. And this is something that makes it much more complex. Another interesting thing that you said for the webinar is that although we know that we have to take action on many different fronts, transportation, energy, waste, you showed us that in Latin America, most of the per capita emissions come from transport if we compare that with other areas. And that makes this webinar even more relevant. And with that, I wanted to call on our guests from the cities, and I would ask them to share their experiences with us. And first, I would like to begin by asking them a couple of questions. I would ask you, what are the commitments of your cities in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and polluting gases too? What is the role of transportation in these emissions, and what is your strategy to reach the objectives? And in terms of mobility, looking at e-mobility, what is the role of cable cars, and what would you say about cable cars in this context? So I would begin with the Undersecretary Diaz. He will be telling us about Mexico. Please go ahead.
Hello and good morning to everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides now. So let me begin by saying, what do we talk about when we're speaking about Mexico City? When we talk about the government of this city, we have 8.8 million inhabitants, but it's part of a metropolitan area, the largest of the world practically, that is close to 21 million inhabitants, of where there are 34.5 million trips every day, but of these, 19.5 are done directly within the city of Mexico. So despite our having a local administration with 9 million inhabitants, our public policies nonetheless need to have a metropolitan nature. If we look at the distribution of transport modes in Mexico, we can see that it is quite favorable compared to other cities in the world. 2/3 of motorized transport is done with public transport. Now, the problems appear here. Despite having a good metro network, in one of the best in the world, because of its vastness, and we have a consolidated rapid transit system, most of the public transport is nonetheless done with microbuses. They are old, obsolete vehicles with an average age of 18 years. And this generates great contribution to emissions. Now, despite having this favorable distribution in types of transport, Mexico City has one of the largest vehicle congestion in the world. So something is not working. And it's not working because of this reason. The number of metropolitan trips between different areas. So from the neighborhood areas, the surrounding areas, are about 4.5 million trips towards those downtown area without there being a good integration about the different types of transport. This results in a lot of inefficiencies, lengthy trips, and high congestion, all of which translates into high emissions. Then there's another topic. It's not only about administration, but it's social also. Inequality is also reflected in the types of mobility. In other words, there's poor distribution. The distances are lengthy because despite the city's growth, the concentration of work and destination remain concentrated in the downtown of the city. So that generates very long trips. Then on the other hand, the structured types of transport, by this I mean so have an exclusive channel, or they might be on rails, could be a BRT, or there is a centralized system such as the trolleybus lines that have a central office. There are only close to half of the population. The other half, those living in the peripheral areas and have these lengthy trips, have less access to a well-structured public transport, as you can see here. As people live further away and their income is lower, they have less access to integrated transport systems. And all of this translates into great inequality. We can see here an image, in other words, the time in which the trips start. We can see that in the Valley of Mexico, people have to start traveling at 4 a.m., those that live furthest away, whereas other people are still sleeping. If you live in the downtown area, then the trip begins at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. when others have already arrived. This shows that people living in the periphery have 4 to 5 hours dedicated every day to their travel, which translates into poor living conditions. The transport sector contributes the mobile sources are responsible for 76% of GHG emissions. And we have ozone at PM 2.5 and PM 10. So we have a sector that is causing poor quality air and are not complying with commitments. This is one of the problems. This vehicle has been in circulation over 30 years. These vehicles are highly polluting. Not only it's a technological problem, but also one of management, because there are inefficiencies, oversupply, lack of security, and poor quality in travel, and also inequality, which pushes people towards individual travel. So the work of the city is focused on 3 axes. Integrate the different types of transport. It has to be seen as a total and not a fragmented. Improve infrastructure and systems, because there is lack of maintenance that leads to decay of the and poor quality. And we need to protect also the health of people. These are the commitments adopted by the current administration. I want to refer to the short-term commitments. In a city, it's more difficult actually to commit to the short term than the long term, because in the short term, I'm responsible. For the long term, somebody else will be responsible. So these are the decarbonization commitments in Mexico. There is a commitment to reduce from 18 to 12 years the average age of the vehicles. It's still a long time, but we must understand that we're starting with 18 so to bring 80% of the public to 5 years. The route in Mexico use a lot of trolleybus. Why? Because the city of Mexico used to have a trolleybus network. So all that infrastructure is already in place. It's a known technology, it's cheaper, and it has zero emissions. So we have focused on that. On the other hand, the RTP public transport also is underway for renewal, because the fleet is currently extremely old. Part of this commitment has started with the electric buses. We hope to have a complete line in operation by next year. And expand not only the technology, but also the infrastructure. The buses don't only have to be clean, they need to be fast, rapid, and clean and efficient. So the commitment is to increase to 100 kilometers by 2024, have 3 lines of cable bus by 2024, and to have 400 kilometers of bicycle lanes. This is the cable bus. Cable bus is a Latin American invention. The BRTs and cable buses are both in many Latin American cities. So the cable system is not only good because it's low emissions, but there's an issue of accessibility and reducing social inequities. They are geared to meet mobility needs of sectors that have difficulty in having access. They live in the peripheral areas with narrow streets, and typically they're the poorest people. This is the case of Line 1, the cable bus that was inaugurated earlier this year. It has a 9.2 kilometer extension. Not only did it reduce the travel time, but it also means that we have zero emissions transport at a cost not zero, unfortunately, but at least it's safe, efficient, and comfortable. It reduces travel time. Furthermore, it has resulted in restructuring the transport system in that area, replacing 214 contaminating microbuses by 108 units. And not only, but they operate in an integrated way without the inefficiencies. These are some of the images of that cable bus. What about demand? Well, at first there was a decline. There was a lot of enthusiasm at first, so many people were trying it out, but it's around 28,000 daily passengers. So it's lower than the original demand. And there was also a drop due to COVID, but nonetheless, the demand has been good. Cable Bus 2 was also inaugurated recently. This system is even more interesting. It's a double system. On the one hand, there's a new trolleybus line that is under construction right now, and this is an elevated trolleybus line. There have been obviously some infrastructure issues, but nonetheless, it does guarantee very high speeds, great reliability in the system, and it complements the cable bus. I'm showing here the elevated trolleybus. It's going to cover practically 8 kilometers. And it ought to be inaugurated at the end of this year or early next year. It will reduce transfer times by half, but even more importantly, as the buses are larger, travel faster, allowing fewer units to satisfy a demand that today requires a lot of units that are highly contaminating, highly polluting. So 235 microbuses are going to be replaced by 23 trolley buses, saving 20 minutes travel time over an 8 kilometers length. This is the type of trolleybus, and this is very important because these are no longer the old trolleybuses that were rigid, but these are quite autonomous, and they can travel around the downtown area. The trolleybus can operate without being linked to the upper cable, so it can provide services without that. This weekend, the Formula One race is going to take place in Mexico, but we're going to be using these trolleybuses. And although it cannot be linked to the power lines, it can operate independently for a certain period of time. And this is complemented by a system operating locally. This is the cable bus. This is the longest line in the world. It is 10.6 kilometers long. Here we can see some of the impact. It has a 50% reduction in travel time, and we calculate that it is 1,900 tons of CO2 reduced by year. There's a very important topic that I'd like to mention here. Arrival of these systems that shorten travel times also has a major social impact, improving not only quality of life, but furthermore, it allows people to have access to an additional 50% of options in work closer to the city. This is a major benefit. These are some images of the cable bus, line 2. It can also improve the urban areas. These are areas that didn't have high quality public spaces. This was done throughout Latin America. In the neighborhoods, we now see that these stations are improving. This used to be a very great panorama, but now we have worked with the community to improve the area. Not only that, but the houses were painted, and this was another encouragement. And this is very interesting. This is cable bus 2. It went beyond what was anticipated as far as demand. We are very proud of this because we have a demand with 56,000 daily passengers on average, and that is more than we had anticipated. We'll have to wait and see what happens after COVID has smoothed out, but there has been great acceptance. This isn't not only a decrease in travel time, but it also provides a better quality in travel. There is dignity in this type of travel, and that is something that we are aiming for. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Undersecretary. That was a wonderful presentation, and I liked that image in which you showed us the start time for travel according to where people lived. And I think that the presentation was very clear in conveying the idea that on the one hand, there are lots of gains to be obtained when it comes to emissions, while at the same time, there being a very important social component where disparities in access to transport are very significant, as we saw on the map. And mechanisms or systems such as cable bus indeed do play a key role. And it's very important to understand that there is a 50% increase in job opportunities for the vulnerable population targeted by cable buses. Let me now offer the floor to Director Cedeño. She is going to tell us about the case of the Dominican Republic. Please go ahead. Thank you, Ernesto, and I'd like to thank the IDB for inviting us as a country, Dominican Republic, and the National Institute of Transport to be able to share with you what steps we have taken for the transformation of our mobility system. So I'm going to share my screen. to briefly show you our current status. As a country, the work tools we have used to restructure the transport system subsector and our commitment to reduce emissions, thinking about climate change, we have developed a number of tools. And this is the most important, the sustainable urban mobility, especially for the downtown area. To provide the context, our goal is to create more inclusive cities that are habitable, to also contribute to the NDCs, because the transport subsector generates 40% of emissions. And in the larger Santo Domingo, as an urban center, we generate 20% of the subsector emissions. We're also aligned with achieving the SDGs and plan mobility in a more global, integral, and participatory manner. We also want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Let me give you now a panorama of mobility in the urban area of Santo Domingo. There are 3 million trips. The distribution is more towards private vehicles, 42% of the trips, and only 36% in public transport, where 9% uses mass transport, 21% on foot, and less than 1% use bicycles. So all the infrastructures that have been developed are more focused on looking at the private vehicles, and therefore congestion and the quality of mass transports are not favorable. So this transport, either in public or private transport, takes over 1 hour. And that's about 30% of a family basket that needs to be spent on mobility. As a territory, and the jurisdiction in the city involves different players. These are the municipality, and we have a national authority that has territorial scope, so that measures to favor transport need to be integrated, and they need to be tied to the local players. So we need to achieve coordination with the central government, working with localities. So we have a number of players going from the mayor's offices and other institutions. We develop the public policy, but then we have state-operated bus companies, we have metro, we have cable car operators. There is 1 line in operation, 2 under construction, where metro line, 1 being expanded, that's lane 1, and we also want to expand line 2. Another line, cable car, is also under construction. So with these linked institutions that are developing the infrastructure, we work on the planning for the sector. Also with the environment of the environment, we want to develop public policies to generate the right conditions to move towards electric mobility, not only for the public transport, but also micro-mobility and private vehicles. So the plan we developed covers actions that are focused on public transportation, have bicycle lines, interconnection between systems, and also to determine the best areas to develop new cable car lines as well as metro lines. This integrated system and this ambition we have as a city is targeting 2030. By then, we want to achieve that 20% reduction in emissions and increase by 30% the coverage. Also, save 20 minutes in travel time and expand the coverage with public transport. We also have another tool that was developed with support from the IDB. It is the National Strategy for Electric Mobility for the Dominican Republic. We're working with the Ministry of Energy and Mines on this in order to have short and long-term emissions and to create the right backdrop for electric mobility. We have been working with the IDB and the French agency to structure urban mobility in order to be able to establish to what extent we can develop actions in favor of sustainable mobility. Likewise, when it look, some short-term projects are being bidded presently to look at priority corridors for public transport to integrate via metro and cable car in order to look at potential sources of financing for the green fund so that public transport providers may procure their electric fleet, because one of the problems we have are the facilities in order to move from traditional vehicles to electrical vehicles and to provide windows for financing, helping them tackle the initial cost of this transition. There will also be lanes that will give preference to the BRTs as well as cycle lanes. This is an image of our mass transport with lines 1 and 2, and in yellow, the first cable car network. That's cable car line 1. And it's already coordinating with the rest of the system. And it can convey 3,000 passengers per hour. Over 80% of our current vehicles are low capacity. These will be replaced by larger vehicles. More than half, or at least the majority of these vehicles will have a 20-year lifespan. The goal is this, to achieve this integration, to connect the system, to have all these transfer points between urban and outskirts connections. This is an image of the vehicle and showing the current and the future. This is the first transport corridor. There will be electronic payments. Let me also speak about charging stations that we want to develop in the city. We want a more efficient city, thus reducing emissions. This is our colonial center, the historical center, the first city in the Americas. Here again, we're also working on a pilot to have a low capacity corridor that is electrically powered to facilitate internal mobility, both of cyclists as well as the rest of the public. This photo is to encourage you to come visit our country. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexandra. We are actually now very keen to go and visit your city. That was a lovely photograph. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. We're now going to move to the second portion of our event. And for this, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Julio Davila, who will tell us about, well, we've already seen part of this in the earlier presentations, but about the social impact metro cable may have. And he will tell us about the potential for this type of transport based on the experience in Medellin, Colombia. Professor, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Ernesto and Maria Camila, for this invitation. It was a very interesting forum, and it was good to hear from the previous presenters. And this has been a lot of food for thought. At these events, one learns a lot. Let me now share my screen. I have been entrusted to speak about the experience of metro cable. I conducted a study about metro cables in Medellin some years ago. And this was the first academic study about metro cables. At the time, there were two lines K and J. Line K inaugurated in 2004. K line is no longer the mother, but the grandmother of all these aerial cable systems that we're seeing in the many cities, such as the one Rodrigo spoke about for Mexico City. I'd like to focus a little bit on something to complement what Rodrigo and others have said and try to link the two topics, decarbonization and social impact provided by cable systems. Based on this study that was done of some years back, it was done in 2012 and 2013, and some books and articles were then published. But I've been following the topic closely, advising on different projects, in Lima, for instance, San Miguelito in Panama. So this goes a little bit beyond simply Medellin, but always supported by the study in Medellin, which, as I said, is either the mother or grandmother of all the other systems. I'm not an expert in decarbonization, but I'm interested in the topic. I've learned a lot and wish to learn even more. I get the impression, and experts will correct me if I'm mistaken, or will chastise me, but a broken down analysis of city decarbonization based on data is extremely interesting. We heard from Ilan about cities in Latin America. And we shouldn't be satisfied because we have a low carbon footprint. We shouldn't just be satisfied with that. We need to help meet the international commitment as well as a commitment towards populations and in particular future generations. For that, we need to decarbonize. But as a person working in transport infrastructure and governance in urban areas, we need to break down this analysis of decarbonization. Rodrigo and others have also already said what's being done, but we need to break it down to different scales. One is a spatial scale. We need to break it down into housing, neighborhood, district, city, and metropolitan area, and look at this on different scales. I have it in my professional DNA to look at the scales. We have to also break down the economic sectors. Ilan or somebody already showed the different carbon emissions from different sectors such as transport, energy, construction, food inputs. And as we heard at the beginning, Latin America is 80% urban. Therefore, we consume, or maybe even 85. So we consume a lot of food and they have a tremendously high carbon footprint. Then the technologies used in these areas. And finally, socioeconomic dimensions of the demand and behavior of consumers. So the thoughts that are relevant to this discussion are metro cables. One thinks about Medellin, and Mexico City is another example, and they have an important socioeconomic component as well as a political one. So thinking now about urban poor and de-urbanization would indicate that urban poor in Latin America have a comparatively very low urban footprint. I'm no expert, once again. Please correct me if I'm mistaken. But honestly, this deserves a closer look. As Rodrigo pointed out, the poor people walk. This is well known, but they also use public transport. Ergo, they individually consume a comparatively favorable level compared to middle class and higher class people. We have to think about the cement that they walk on. They also live in high densities and in a smaller space that needs to be lit up or heated in the cold areas, for instance. And this has a low rate of energy per people. They don't often eat beef. We know this has an impact because of the methane. There's a high carbon consumption, and they seldom travel by plane. except for a few of us. I just arrived last night from London, and I came from across the Atlantic with a high carbon footprint. Please let me know if I'm keeping to my allotted time. I better put a timer on here. Cable cars, as somebody said, have a long history, but urban cable cars that have been used as a method for mass transport, or at least as close as possible to mass transport, only go back as far as 2004 for the K line in Medellin. The others were tourist lines, as we saw on the slide. This is a technology over 100 years old, used originally for passengers in mountainous areas and also for cargo and snow tourism. We know of it in Europe, in Argentina and Chile and others, and to a lesser extent urban. It's only in 2004, as I said, that it became a mass transport system, or at least as a complement to mass transport in a city. For technical reasons, and Rodrigo spoke about the longest line that is being built or was built, 10 kilometers long, and that's rare. Normally they're 3, 4, maybe even 5 kilometers, but now the machines used are very powerful. So it depends also on topography, but normally they are short lines up to 3 kilometers with passengers. Normally, I think 3,000. La Paz might be an exception with more, but their footprint is spatially limited to a neighborhood, a district. So we have this notion of decarbonization. It needs to include all of these scales, such as the neighborhoods, and that provides access to mountain areas. And in Colombia, for instance, they are not considered as mass transport as BRTs would be, and therefore did not deserve funding from the state.
So all of the cables in Medellin were financed, with the exception of the most recently inaugurated one, were financed by the municipality of Medellin with local resources, in contrast to La Paz, that was financed by the national government. In most cases, you can say that these are remedial transportation systems to deal with problems of access to unplanned marginal areas of housing development. Now, if you were to consider this before those neighborhoods were built, I don't know if we would include cable cars. They are remedial by definition. And that is an interesting thought, because that means that we're trying to put them into an urban, socioeconomic, cultural reality that were not planned, that are informal by nature. In the case of Medellin, we have these lines K and J, and 5 more are being added, and they're all being connected to low-income neighborhoods that are dense, that are informal, and that have socioeconomic problems. We have seen this in Cali, San Juan, and other areas like San Juan Lurigancho and Lima. So there has been considerable expansion across Latin America. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to conclude soon. I have an urgent call, but all of these are solutions to transportation problems in neighborhoods that are affected by violence, that have that serious problem. And it helped with the issue a colleague calls is the Trojan horse, to be able to access areas where people are armed. Now, here we classified into 3 areas the metro cable systems. We have the district or neighborhood scale systems, then another system that is poorly integrated to the mass transport system. I think it was in Rio. It was a disaster. It was not well integrated. Neither was the one in Caracas. And systems that operate as mass transport, because of the topography, because of the institutionality, And that would be the case of La Paz and also Manizales. Now, what is the potential for decarbonization of metro cables? As an ex post facto solution to existing problems, their construction means a smaller physical footprint, fewer expropriations, and less demolition, and consequently a lower carbon footprint in comparison to conventional rail systems where you have to demolish and build much more. So there is that advantage. Now, in the case of Medellin, they're using hydroelectric power, and a study was done, but the information presented by Rodrigo on Mexico is much more up to date. This is a study that was done in 2009 for the J line in Medellin with, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it is the baseline, business as usual. In other words, these are the emissions that we would have had they not developed the metro cable system. And this is the projected line in terms of CO2 equivalent tons, which is much smaller. And of course, you can also see the leakages. I'm about to conclude, but what I wanted to refer to here is the potential to change the situation. That is the case of the metro cable in Medellin. The first one was isolated, but then they also did urban regeneration projects hand in hand with doing social improvement and integrating those marginal peripheral neighborhoods to the city as a whole. This meant an investment, and there the municipality focused more on the poor, on the low-income neighborhoods, and that was under the Fajardo administration. He did not build the metro cable. The previous administration did. Then that led to the comprehensive urban projects. Those are neighborhoods where there was investment in infrastructure, creation of public spaces, housing was improved, greater social services were provided. And an important thing is that by investing in these priorities, and thanks to the topography of Medellin, these cable cars made the poverty of Medellin much more visible. And I think that reducing poverty, the first step to do that is making poverty visible to most of the population that doesn't feel that it is poor. Often surveys tell us that the poor don't feel poor, that the rich feel that they're poorer than they actually are. But all of this ties in with visibility, and making poverty more visible means that investments like the investments made by Medellin, if you can upend that social pyramid, that means that the poor become more acceptable. People can see that there are the poor. Now, we did another study on Suacha, that is a neighborhood close to Bogota, but the taxpayer in Bogota, the voter in Bogota, doesn't care at all that there is poverty out in Suacha. They never see those people. They're never close to that place. So in Medellin, it's hard to avoid seeing the poor because of the rugged topography. So this project made the poor more visible. Now, Medellin is putting its wager on multimodality. Here you can see the BRT, and they're now doing e-buses. There's the metro cable, and also the biking system. Bikes are free of charge. Now, metro cables are in neighborhoods that are informal, that use a lot of public transportation. This is a figure that goes back to 2018. I think I'm actually over my time, but simply to show you some pictures so you can see how the urban development has improved. These are pictures before and after, urban parks. They call this urban acupuncture, with very little disappropriation. And then some figures, and this goes up to 2010. Note, it is 2002, 2010. The investment in Metro Cable was around $24 million. So that was very cheap at the time. But the investment in public space, social infrastructure, there they invested 8 times more, 225 million US dollars. There was an increase in public space. Also, most of the jobs were given to local residents. That was a decision made on purpose by the mayor's office. They built 18 new parks for pedestrian bridges, and tourism became a new source of employment. And in the past, not even the police could enter into these areas of the city because basically the neighborhoods were in the hands of gangs and urban guerrillas. And a key element in all of this was the decision to invest something like 10%. 10% of the investments of the municipality were done through the participatory budget. A colleague of mine who has studied this process for many years says that the process in Medellin is perhaps the most successful one. Now, often students ask me, okay, was there gentrification? There is evidence that, yes, there was an increase in the price of the houses, and also rentals went up. Now, here is the English version of this study. It is downloadable free of charge, and it is also available in Spanish. And here is the bibliography. I would be glad to share all of this with you, and I apologize if I went over my time allotted. Thank you, Maria Camila. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julio. That was very interesting. It's truly impressive to see the urban improvement pictures that you showed us. Often this is related to the decisions, the investment decisions having to do with the K line. And as you said, K line is the mother, the grandmother of all of the cable car systems that we have seen built in Latin America. Now, it is interesting now to see that this all began 17 years ago. So I'm sure that there is a wealth of information. It would be interesting, and perhaps this is something that you have studied, but it would be interesting to look at the jobs created around the K line, thanks to the investments that you showed us, but also linked to what was said by Undersecretary Diaz. He talked about access to other jobs in other areas of the city. That how did it affect the vulnerable populations that live in the area of influence, the catchment area of the K line? Now, perhaps you could answer that later on. What I would do now is ask Undersecretary Diaz and Director Cedeno, I would ask you to comment on the presentation just made by Professor Davila based on the experience that you're having in your own cities. So please go ahead. Let's begin with Alexandra Cedeno, and then I will give the floor to Rodrigo Diaz. Yes, we agree fully with what the professor was saying. The cable line that we have, we call it the cable car system, is a complement for that area of poor access. Not only are they low income, but they have accessibility problems. We don't have a rugged topography that would justify these lines, but it's a problem of access. And for people to move to these areas in the rush hours, it takes more than 1 hour. So this is now an alternative. It provides a savings in travel time for users. But all of these are measures that are accepted and highly used in areas where travel is difficult. So this has been a complement of the comprehensive public transportation system. They connect, they feed into our metro system, our mass transport system, and then there is transfer to our bus system. Now, there is a formal transportation system here, but this is one more element that helps these people that live in marginalized communities. Well, Professor Davila said something that's very interesting. If you measure the carbon footprint, this increases income. So this affects the major emitters of polluting products, but this has to be balanced with a policy, in the case of mobility especially, a policy that aims at reducing inequities. And here what we have, and this applies across Latin America, is an inequity that has marginalized and has consolidated poverty systems on the periphery of the cities. And in terms of cable cars, and for me, decarbonization of cable systems is basically an add-on. What we're trying to do is fight poverty, provide access. That's what cable cars did in Medellin. When you see how this reduces travel time, that enlarges the size of the city. So it's more a matter of saying, let's physically guarantee access to the entire city, so the whole city can enjoy the city by shortening distances. So that is the merit of these systems. And because of that, there are greater job, educational opportunities that open up. And this is an add-on because it allows the rest of the city to see these areas. It becomes a tourist attraction. It is a safe way to get an overview of the city. In the case of our city, people can see the city in a new way. You can get off of the cable car, you can consume, you can eat something. It's the case of Mango Beach. And it's not gentrification. And a woman set up a shop where she was selling some local dish. And so this dynamized the economy. It gets people out seeing the city. People go visit areas like Acotepe from Santa Catalina. These are areas that before were not accessible, but people are out there now getting acquainted with a new reality. So they go from the center to the periphery, and that is interesting because it creates greater dynamism on the periphery where there had not been any for years.
That, I think, is what's truly interesting. And not only that, but the cost and infrastructure, yes, they're high, no doubt about it. It's not a panacea. I can't tell everybody, put up a cable system. You need to have the right conditions. Sometimes you need to look at the topography, and therefore, in certain conditions, it's advisable to have this kind of system. So I can't tell everybody to put a cable car, or I can't tell everybody to put a BRT. There is no universal solution. It needs to be adapted to the current circumstances. Thank you very much, Julio. If you'd like to react to these comments very briefly, because we do have some questions from the public for actually all four speakers. So Julio, would you like to react to? You're muted. Julio's microphone is mute. I'm sorry, I do apologize. But I was saying, thank you very much. No, there's nothing I want to add right now. Just I can add to what I said earlier, and Rodrigo and Alexandra, but I think that it would be very much better if we move to the questions, because there are some very interesting questions and it's an active discussion. And with multitasking, there's only some that we'll be able to address. Maria Camila has already given me some of the questions. So let me read 4 of them, and you can answer those. And if we have time, we'll move to another set of 4. We don't have too much time, but let's do it that way. One question is, I'd like to know what basic indicators should be available to the cities as to the contributions they all need to make to meet the climate neutrality targets. Specifically, what indicators? Where do we begin to have social control? Another question. When it comes to public transport, how with a pandemic such as COVID be dealt with when in closed spaces and with many people, transmission of the disease could increase? Another question, how to handle decarbonization of buses when very frequently they're private companies or cooperatives operating them? And another one, the graphs not only classify the cities by emission, but also by size. That referred to the first presentation, that by Ilham. Large cities are usually more segregated economically, and the poor areas generate the longer distance displacements. I'd like to know if there are strategies differentiated by size. Perhaps we need a better transport network, or should we perhaps think of new ways to develop cities and where the job locations will be? So those are the first lot of questions. Any one of you can answer them before we move to another batch. Let me begin with the last question, because I think it encompasses many. Yes, there is no doubt that to link this to land use is the ideal formula. But to change land use is slow. It's extremely slow, actually. It can take decades in cities that are already built. Mexico City, for instance, the size has been frozen for 30 years. It hasn't grown in population or in footprint. I'm referring to Mexico City, the outlying areas, yes, but in Mexico City, you've already got the buildings, the roads, the land use can change, yes, but extremely gradually. So I insist that what we need to think about is to think about short-term strategies to help us live with what's in place. What we have in this particular case is a city where 50% of the surface is covered by informal settlements. The roads is informal. It's not a planned routing of the maps, of the roads, I'm sorry. Sometimes you have no sidewalks. It has been developed by the way individuals have informally built on it. Our transport system needs to adapt to this, and that, I think, is the advantage of cable systems, because they accept the reality on the ground and imprint a new way to understand that reality without having to demolish anything in its passage. In other words, it focuses on the lack of accessibility of the suburban areas. And that's what the large cities need to think about. They need to think about all the suburban areas, because the centers sometimes were planned and things work well. But the problem that has not been tackled by mobility public policy refers to the outlying areas. So as administration, we have actually focused on intervening in these outlying areas that were abandoned for decades, where the state never intervened or did so poorly. That is a major social debt that we carry and that we need to address. And all of these systems developed in Latin America actually do that. We didn't show everything. There are also bicycles being used for transport and for taxi, but there's a lot of inaccessibility for these areas that are far away. There is a recipe, it's not infallible. It's not a recipe that can be adapted to everyone. A city with 20 million inhabitants, such as Mexico, has a reality that is not compatible with what happens in intermediate cities or with cities with other topographies. So that it shows that we need to look at the problem in different ways according to the local context, and that is something we can learn. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Let me now offer the floor to Alexandra, Julio, or Ilan, if you'd like to answer one of the other questions. We only have a few more minutes available to us, but nonetheless, let me give you the floor. I think Julio ought to close out here. I think he must be thinking about ways to provide an answer. But let me point out that as an institution, as I said, we are building a mobility observatory in order to develop those indicators that need to be used to measure this process for the migration, moving from the current situation to a future one. And we haven't yet made much progress in developing the indicators. The planners used to speak about congestion rates and the amount of fuel being wasted, but today, no, we've changed that. Today is how do we calculate emissions? How do we achieve savings? What are the air indicators? So there are other ways to measure decarbonization and to establish methodologies that become standards applicable to many countries. So that answers the question about indicators. We need to look at the coverage of mass transport, what are savings in travel time. There are other perspectives, other variables, and that is why we are creating our mobility observatory. Let me also answer to another question. How does the migration process take place, especially on buses, moving from private operators to have an impact on changing the fleet configuration? This is a legal problem. We have determined how the operation has to take place, not only as a law, but also as the regulation for public transport. Unions now have to create companies. They need to meet certain service qualities. They need to change their fleet to comply with the new standards. With this legal framework, we are moving towards this migration, the transformation of operators. And this obviously entails a social aspect also. It's not that the vehicles disappear. So there is a social component as to how to get rid of the old vehicles, the social security to protect the drivers, and these very same bus drivers can then be moved out of the old system into the new system. They are trained in operating the new buses. So it's nice to hear that a informal driver today becomes a formal driver with a proper work schedule, better living condition. Now, obviously, the process is slow because we want it to be sustainable over time. Thank you very much. Julio. Well, very briefly, we only have 3 minutes left and I have another conference coming up and I need to leave you very quickly. But Alexandra and Rodrigo answered those questions very well. As usual happens with these webinars, there are many unanswered questions. It would be much nicer to meet face-to-face over a coffee and spend hours talking about it. But public transport and pandemic causes a lot of anxiety for municipalities because public transport obviously are financed, as Rodrigo said, with the fares charged. It's very difficult for cities to provide subsidies. In Europe or in London, where I live, we have seen that there was a radical drop in use of public transport for obvious reasons, but now there has been a pickup in bus usage. It's almost 100%, but the subway in London remains very low. I believe it's at 60% still, but London has a service population that can work from home. That's about 43% of the London labor force can work from home. And there is pressure by employers for them to go back to the offices, but a lot of reluctance. And this has caused major financial problems for Transport of London that manages the subway system and buses as well, at least they administer them. But the trains also. I don't think it's going to be such a problem. When people are vaccinated, I don't think it's such a major source of transmission. Scientists at first were saying that the infection was transmitted from surfaces. It still happens, but to a lesser extent. So we need to have people encouraged to go back to public transport. Those that don't have alternatives are already doing it. 70 or 80% of the labor force in Latin America have to use public transport because otherwise they can't earn their living. So let me stop there. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up, so we can't continue answering the questions. So I invite you all, if you can answer some of the questions in the chat, to please do so. But basically, we're at the end of the webinar. So let me invite Ernesto Roa, the IDB's transport sector chief, to give some closing comments. Thank you very much, Ernesto. Hopefully you can hear me well. Good. Well, on behalf of the urban development of the IDB, I'd like to particularly thank all the panelists for their interventions. Ernesto Stein, who guided us so wisely to navigate this very interesting topic, one that is highly complex. But in particular, I'd like to thank the attendees who have made their own inputs known. We have seen in the chat lots of comments and in the Q&A, and as Julio said, this can lead to a very lengthy discussion that we would all like. We need to decarbonize the public transport in Latin America and the Caribbean, as we have all heard about from the UN report. 80% of our population lives in cities, so decarbonization of urban transport will improve the quality of life and health of most of our peoples. So along these lines, urban transport becomes a key infrastructure for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As we can see in several studies, these mass transport increase employment and also formalization of the vulnerable sectors of population. The benefited users are mostly in distant areas, living outside of the city centers, and therefore they have less opportunities to jobs, education, and health. There are many gaps, but this is the decade of climate ambition with a joint responsibility of the international community to achieve the SDGs while meeting the purpose of containing climate heating to the target of 1.5 degrees. There needs to be greater access to transport, but control the emissions that are traditionally associated to the sector. There are three key elements. First, access to mass public transport that is affordable and high quality. The term quality here is key because it has a financial impact. This has been discussed at length today. And there are institutional challenges. In other words, to establish these systems is complex in our context and require heavy investment. The second is electrification of mass transport, as we have heard today, not only for the mass transport, but it needs to be for cargo and individual transportation also. And lastly, although we have the largest level of mass transport in our region, we also have the largest growth in private vehicles. It could be cars, but it's also motorcycles. And in many cases, these vehicles or the use of these vehicles is taking away from demand in public transport. The process needs to be streamlined and find ways to reduce private transportation, let it become something subordinate to mass transport. Today, to illustrate this, we have focused on presenting experiences in the use of cable cars such as Mexico and Santo Domingo. These are alternatives of low carbon transport. They show that this kind of an intervention makes a direct impact on reducing the inequity in our cities. This is one of the major lessons we can draw from today's presentations. It's also a better option for mobility in cities in certain situations such as those described today. It doesn't apply to all cases, but only to some, but they do take over some of the mobility that would have a higher carbon emission. Furthermore, it's a structural improvement for neighborhoods, strengthen the communities, and improve their quality of life. There were other successful examples, such as in La Paz, Bolivia, the telepheric, where IDB worked on the bill, contributed financing for the Silver Line's construction. The urban Transport and Development team at the IDB will continue providing technical and financial aid for design and implementation of user-friendly mobility systems that are also friendly towards the environment. Hopefully, you've all enjoyed today's webinar. We hope you found it useful and will inspire us to find ways to continue improving the living standards in our cities. So thank you all very much and good afternoon to you all. Thank you all. Have a good day.